I guess, unlike the people who say, I'll keep this brief, and then
Oh
you
my
just
God.
know.
Yeah, like at conferences when I just have a short question. Uh-oh. It's more of a comment than a question.
Um, okay. So I think we should start. So I would like to welcome everyone to our online seminar series. My name is Elsen Kingma. I'm the Sowerby Chair of Philosophy Medicine at King's College London, and me and my wonderful team are organizing this a wonderful attached team, not to me, attaching this online seminar series. I apologize, my house is very cold, that's why I'm here in a hoodie. So before we start, I would like to take a moment to thank the Sowerby Foundation for supporting our project at the intersection of philosophy and medicine. They support everything we do. And we're very pleased that they gave us this opportunity to try and showcase any kind of work that sits at the intersection of philosophy and medicine. And we think that there are many such intersections. And so for this seminar series, we're looking particularly at ancient philosophy and ancient medicine, which had lots to say about the intersection of philosophy and medicine. And so it is my pleasure tonight to introduce Professor Peter Adamson, who is a professor at Munich, although we also like to still hold on to him as a little bit of a professor at KCL as well. So Peter, over to you. Welcome. We look forward to your talk.
Okay, thanks very much. And if there are any technical problems, if anyone can't hear me all of a sudden, do something so I know. Okay, so hi everyone. Yeah, so I'm really pleased to be talking to people at my old stomping grounds at King's College. I am actually someone who has worked quite a bit on the relationship between philosophy and medicine, usually in a less metaphorical sense than what I'm about to discuss. So as you'll see, this is really going to be about medicine as a metaphor for philosophical argument, which I think is important. And I'm going to actually start by talking about the history of that just a little bit. But maybe I should just mention that I have also done a lot of work on Galen and the reception of Galen in the Arabic world. So if anyone's interested in that, then we could talk about it afterwards. But this is about something different, namely one of the most famous late ancient philosophical works written by Boethius, who was a Christian Aristotelian Platonist writing in the early 6th century CE. And the basic point of this talk, which is based on a paper that I've been writing together with Tad Brennan and Cornell, because we did a seminar together, actually very much like this. We did an online seminar about Boethius. So the point of the talk is that Boethius represents philosophical consolation as being like medicine. And in a way, this is just almost what you would have expected him to do. So to put it mildly, did not invent the idea of comparing philosophy to medicine. So you've probably even seen some of this already in the series, because I think I'm not the first speaker. There's a long running tradition of comparing philosophy to medicine, going all the way back to Democritus, who's a pre-Socratic philosopher. So he's pretty early. He's even earlier than Plato. In fact, he's a contemporary of Socrates. So he said that medicine cures the sicknesses of the body and wisdom the affections of the soul, or maybe the afflictions, perhaps, of the soul. Or you might think of Epicurus's so-called fourfold remedy. So these are like 4 principles of Epicurean philosophy that you're supposed to repeat to yourself to relieve yourself from suffering, because he was a hedonist who thought that the ultimate pleasure would consist in eliminating all suffering, right? Another interesting case, and particularly interesting because it comes from a philosopher who was also a doctor, is Sextus Empiricus. So Sextus Empiricus lives also in late antiquity, but earlier than Boethius. He's 2nd century. And he was a Pyrrhonist or Pyrrhonist. In other words, he's pursuing a kind of skepticism named after the early skeptic Pyrrho. But the Empiricus in his name is not a reference to the idea of being an empirical doctor, or sorry, it's not a reference to being an empirical philosopher. It's a reference to him being an empirical doctor. So he was a member of the so-called empiricist school, which rejected the idea of coming up with theories in medicine and said that you should just do whatever has worked in the past. This is an interesting medical epistemological position. And this maybe goes along with his stance in philosophy, where he's a thoroughgoing skeptic. And actually, it would be well worth giving a whole paper just about this as well. So again, we can talk about this afterwards if you want to. But Sextus, when he's trying to motivate his skeptical project, what he says is that people experience a lot of disturbance, the Greek word is tarache, from wondering about things, especially wondering about various philosophical problems. And they get agitated by the fact that they can't find the answers. And he represents skepticism as a form of relief or a method of being released from this disturbance. Basically, the idea being that once you examine each issue, you'll see that the arguments on both sides of the debate are kind of equally poised. And then you'll just suspend judgment, and that will somehow free you from being worried about it. Because you're like, well, no way to tell. Let's move on, right? And I think it's not a coincidence that Sextus was a doctor and had this kind of sort of medicalized approach to motivating skepticism. Okay, so this is a long-running sort of topos in Greek and Roman philosophy, and we're going to be looking at it in Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy. So I don't know how many of you have read the Consolation. It's a famous late ancient work of philosophy, but that's sort of like, you know, being the shortest giant. So because most late ancient philosophical works are not famous. So let me introduce the text to you briefly. So it's a work in 5 books, and it begins showing Boethius, the author, as a fictional character. So this is like Dante's Divine Comedy or other works where the author actually puts themselves into the work as a character. And to keep things straight, people often refer to the character of Boethius in the work as the prisoner, and then refer to the author as Boethius. So that's what I'm going to do, okay? So at the beginning, Boethius represents himself as a prisoner, and this is based on the situation he was actually in at the time. So he'd been put in under house arrest by the emperor because the emperor thought that Boethius had been conspiring against him. And although this is not mentioned in the text, so perhaps when he writes this, he still thinks he's going to be let out. But in fact, he was executed in the end, shortly thereafter. So this is very much his last work. And he represents himself in his library, sort of surrounded with the tools of his own liberation, as it were, because what he's going to do is he's going to liberate himself from the suffering he feels through philosophy. And the prisoner at the beginning is like weeping and carrying on and lamenting. And then this person appears to him. Interestingly, it's a woman. And there, by the way, again, one could give a whole talk about the kind of gender issues here. So this character, Lady Philosophy, who appears to him, is the first of many, many such characters who appear in medieval literature, really on the basis of Lady Philosophy, because this work was extremely popular. In fact, you're going to see lots of, in my PowerPoint presentation, you're going to see lots of pictures from medieval manuscripts of the Consolation, because it was such a popular text, and they're all often illuminated manuscripts, in other words, manuscripts with pictures. So Lady Philosophy, this influential kind of literary figure, appears to the prisoner, and as the title promises, offers him consolation that will make him feel better about his situation. Now, one thing that's maybe surprising is that from the very beginning, when the prisoner says why he's lamenting, his lament kind of has a more philosophical form than you might expect. So you would think that he'd be lamenting because he's been put in prison, all of his wealth and power and honor has been taken away from him. But he says that's not really the issue. The issue is, I know I'm a good person, So how can something like this happen to someone like me, right? Now, obviously, the fact that it has happened to him is relevant, right? Because it's brought him to face to face with this kind of problem of theodicy, the sort of why do bad things happen to good people problem. But he at least claims that the reason he's so upset is that he doesn't understand how, in a world that's run by a just providential God, something like this could have happened to him. Okay, so that's the setup. By the way, parenthetically, a famous kind of problem about the Consolation is that although Boethius is a Christian, you can't tell that from reading the work. So you can tell that he believes in God, but it could be like the Platonists' God. It doesn't have to be a Christian God, and there's no overt reference to anything Christian in the work. We do have other works by Boethius that are about things like the Trinity and the Incarnation, which are so explicitly Christian works. And people have been so perplexed by this that there even used to be a question as to whether the same guy wrote both bodies of text. So whether the theologian Boethius wrote this work at all. But it is clearly by the same guy. And the explanation would be that he is deliberately trying to use the kind of instruments and armory of pagan classical philosophy in order to cope with his predicament. So Lady Philosophy represents pagan philosophy. And that's clear from some of the things she says, like at one point she refers to my Aristotle, right? So she is the personification of the classical pagan philosophers, Plato, Aristotle, the Stoics. Okay, so that's the setup of the work. At the beginning, Boethius has been trying to comfort himself using poetry. And so he says that it's not just Lady Philosophy who's there with him in the room. There's also the Muses, and this is a nice picture showing the Muses. And Lady Philosophy comes in and banishes them. And we're on page 1 here, right? And we already get the first reference to the idea that this is all going to be kind of medicalized. Because what she says about the muses of classical poetry is that they do not offer cures, but only poison, whereas she, as the incarnation of philosophy, can bestow health upon him. So she's offering a genuine cure. You might think that the muses are being compared to charlatans, right? So people who would offer to help you, but actually will make you worse, right? And none of this is very surprising because as we've seen, the comparison of philosophy to medicine, especially medicine for the soul, as opposed this is a sort of a standard topos as well, that the kind of medicine that your group is mostly thinking about is medicine for the body, right? But the kind of medicine that is philosophy is medicine for the soul. In fact, you might even say that this is not a metaphor, the way I've been talking about it, but that there's actually two kinds of medicine, medicine for the body and medicine for the soul. And medicine for the soul is just philosophy, or is maybe part of philosophy, like ethics, right? In fact, one of the philosophers from the Islamic world that I've written about a lot, named Abu Bakr Arazi, who lived in the 9th to the 10th century, wrote a pair of works, one an encyclopedia of medicine, and then another called The Spiritual Medicine, in which he says, okay, I've given you medicine for the body, now medicine for the soul, right? So there you actually have the idea that medicine is subdivided into two parts, not that philosophy is metaphorically medicine. But the way Lady Philosophy deals with it is much more metaphorical, I think. But it's a metaphor that keeps coming up again and again in the work. And it really gets interesting early on in this passage. So we're still in book 1 here. And she says to the prisoner, since you are buffeted by a tumult of different passions, with grief, anger, and sorrow pulling you in different directions, for that is your mental state, you are not yet ready for strong remedies. So we shall for a little while use milder ones, so that by our gentler touch what has swollen hard under the influence of all these passions and worries may soften and become fit to be treated with sharper, stronger medicine. One thing to already notice here is that this is not a kind of vague, oh, well, you're suffering, so I'll heal you. This is a very specific reference to a very specific medical problem, namely a swelling, right? So we've got to build up a swollen, hardened part of the body, and it has to be calmed down or sort of chilled through the milder medicines that she's going to use. And then that will make him ready to be treated with sharper, stronger medicine. So the reason why Tad and I thought this is interesting is that it's so specific. It's like it's well beyond, like I said, it's well beyond the idea that ethics is a kind of cure for the soul. It, in fact, seems to be gesturing towards a whole course of treatments, right? And then the question would be, the interesting question would be, does this course of treatment actually reflect something about the way Boethius understands his work to function? Much later in the work, we get a reference to the same idea where and this is just a kind of almost remark that she makes in passing. She says, it's not unlike that which is a wonder to the ignorant, why with some healthy bodies sweet things agree with others bitter, or why some ill people are helped by mild medicines, others by sharp ones. That this is hardly a wonder to the doctor, who distinguishes the manner and temper of health itself and of illness. So here we have an additional idea. Not only are there mild medicines and sharp medicines, but the competent doctor is the one who knows which kind of medicine to give to which kind of patient. And this, of course, is a very prominent feature of ancient medical literature. So you'll see this in Galen quite often, that a good doctor is not just someone who kind of knows the treatment for each disease. A good doctor is someone who can holistically evaluate the patient and come up with the right treatment for that patient. So it's a kind of particularist approach to medicine. It also explains why doctors should be paid so much money by their aristocratic clients, right? Because if you're sort of offering this bespoke treatments, that would be a rationale for why you can charge so much money. So first of all, it seems there's several references to a more maybe sophisticated understanding of how medicine works. But even more than that, I mean, if you look at this opening passage that I just read before, so we'll use milder medicines and then we'll use sharper and stronger ones. Not only does she say this, but she comes back to it. So when she gets to the middle of book 2, so remember there's 5 books, so we're 1.5 books in. And then she says, okay, that was it for the mild medicines. Now here come the stronger medicines. And then we get a sort of battery of arguments at the end of book 2, which I'll get on to explaining. And then at the start of book 3, she says, okay, now here comes a new kind of medicine, namely medicines that sting on the tongue, but sweeten once taken within. So obviously, as a philosophical reader, it's very easy to kind of blow past things like this because it's not an argument and it just seems like literary flourish, right? But if you take it seriously, then it looks like what Lady Philosophy is promising is that she's going to offer 3 different kinds of argument or something, or maybe it's not clear that they'll all be arguments, but she'll offer 3 kinds of philosophical discourse, perhaps, which metaphorically correspond to 3 different kinds of medicine. First, mild medicine, then stronger medicine, and then this more complicated kind of medicine, which is bitter on the tongue, but sweet once ingested, which is a strange idea, right? So you might think of like some bitter medicine that when you swallow it, your chest sort of warms up and it feels nice. I guess that's the idea. And so Tad and I thought, well, let's take this seriously and think about the stretches of argument that are demarcated as corresponding to these 3 kinds of medicine and figure out what the difference is. That's the kind of the project, okay? All right, so our answer is the following. Just as when you use mild medicines to calm the symptoms of a disease, like the swelling of a tumor or something like that, or maybe a tumor would be maybe that's too dramatic, but like let's say a buildup of blood in the body. So it's causing this kind of inflammation and swelling. And then you would put something on it like a poultice, which actually Lady Philosophy mentions a couple of times, and that would cool down the swelling, right? That's the mild remedy. And that in philosophy, that would have as the correlate an argument that is intended to just calm down the soul. so that it would be ready for further treatment. Then the stronger medicines actually target the source of the problem. So it's like the first step is to offer medicine that eliminates the symptoms. The second step, the stronger medicines, would be the ones that eliminate the disease. And then the bitter and then sweet medicines, we think, are supposed to give the prisoner a new way of seeing the world, which is so not just like getting rid of his false beliefs and ideas and desires, but now building up a kind of new orientation or new set of values. That's the basic idea of what I'm going to say. And the idea that this is what you should do when you're offering consolation actually also has some precedent in earlier philosophy. So there's an interesting debate that happened amongst the Stoics, and in particular between two of the early Stoics, Cleanthes and Chrysippus. We know about this because it's reported on later by Cicero. So they had a kind of debate about what a Stoic sage or what a Stoic philosopher should say to someone who's having some kind of emotional problem. Like, for example, grieving over the loss of a loved one, or, being upset that they've just been put in jail by the emperor and are about to be executed. That would be a classic example, right? So what should the Stoics say to someone like this? Well, the official Stoic line is that these things don't matter. The only thing that matters is happiness, which you achieve by being virtuous, and your money, your health, your family, anything that happens to you is kind of not really a matter of your concern. As long as you're virtuous, you'll be happy. As long as you're not virtuous, you won't be happy. That's the Stoic philosophy, right? And Cleanthes says, well, so what you should do is you should try to get these people to stop believing that things like wealth are valuable, because they're not. And we have arguments to show that they're not, right? And Chrysippus said, well, no, that won't work. And this is a quotation from what he said, for if you have persuaded the mourner that nothing is bad unless it is contrary to virtue, then you have removed not his sorrow, but his viciousness altogether. But the time for consolation is not the right time for doctrinal instruction. So in other words, if you're confronted with, for example, someone mourning for the death of a loved one, you shouldn't start by saying, oh, well, actually, whether or not your loved one was alive didn't matter. Because of course they're going to, that's not going to help, right? They're going to be outraged and upset. Instead, you should offer some kind of consolation that stops them from being so sad. So you should suppress their emotional reaction. And then once they're calm, you can say, okay, now actually let's talk about whether you were right to believe that it was such a misfortune that your loved one died. Maybe that was the will of God, right? But you shouldn't start with that. You should start by addressing their emotional state, says Chrysippus. And so we think that Boethius, consciously or not, is sort of the heir to Chrysippus's theory of how consolation works. So let's look more specifically at some of the things that Lady Philosophy says about these stages of treatment. So when she starts to give the first stretch of argument in book 1, she says, it's not yet time for strong medicines. The nature of human minds is such that when they lose true opinions, they have to take up false ones. And then a fog arises from these false ideas, which obscures that true vision. So I shall try for a little while with gentle and moderate poultices to lessen that fog, so that when the darkness of those deceptive ideas is removed, you may be able to recognize the glory of the light of truth. Notice the poultice idea. So this is going along with the idea of trying to cure a painful swelling, right? Because a poultice, I guess, is like a sort of plaster with some medicine pasted onto it, and then it, somehow heals the swelling. No doubt some of you know more about how poultices work than I do, because you're all medical people. Okay, so now this is an interesting passage, and actually it suggests that maybe Boethius agrees with Cleanthes and not Chrysippus, right? Because she says, well, the problem is that people have these false opinions, and then they get kind of fogged from these false ideas, and that's their problem. But actually, if you think about it more carefully, I mean, this is a very complicated metaphor, and maybe not a great metaphor because there's too much going on. There's seeing and fog, and then there's poultices and it's kind of a mixed metaphor, but the idea seems to be, okay, your problem is you have false beliefs, and the false beliefs give rise to a kind of fog, which prevents you from seeing, okay? And then the mild medicines are going to eliminate the fog. That's the weird mixed metaphor. So what would this mean in practice? We think that it means that the suffering or the fog is supposed to basically be the consequences of having false beliefs about the world. And in particular, what that would mean is things like being in an agitated emotional state because you believe that something like wealth is valuable. So if the emperor steals all your wealth and you think wealth is important and valuable, and you maybe even think that your happiness is predicated upon wealth, then arising from that will be an emotional reaction, and that's the fog, okay? If you could just eliminate the emotional reaction, then you'd put the soul in a position to recollect what it should already have known, like the truths kind of hidden within it, which seems to be an allusion to Plato's theory of recollection. So as she says, clouded and hidden by the body's parts, the mind is not totally forgetful of itself and retains the whole while losing the separate parts. Therefore, whoever seeks the truth is in a middle state, neither knowing nor yet being altogether unknowing. We could go more into this and like what he's saying here about the kind of epistemology of it and how it relates to Plato. But the main point is just that lady philosophy here is not actually targeting the prisoner's false beliefs. She's targeting the prisoner's emotional reactions. So what ancient philosophers would call the passions. And she actually says what they are, the passions in question. They are desire for worldly goods. So things like the desire to have wealth, the desire to have a successful family, the desire for honor. And it's because of these desires and their lack of fulfillment that the prisoner is, as she says, buffeted by a tumult of different emotions and grief and anger and sorrow. And in fact, that goes all the way back, sorry, I'm going backwards here, to the very first passage, right? So that was the beginning of the passage. I put it at the beginning. So grief, anger, and sorrow. So that shows that his problem is really emotions in the first instance. And then in the second instance, it's the opinions or beliefs, the false beliefs that gave rise to these emotions. The fact that her initial reaction is aimed at dealing with his emotional state is shown very poignantly by actually my favorite moment in the entire work, in the entire constellation. So he's weeping, right? And he can't even talk because he's so upset. So she takes the train of her dress and dries the tears from his face, sort of like a mother taking care of a weeping child, right? Very nice little moment. And I think it stands for, again, it's the kind of moment that philosophically minded readers would probably just go past. But I think it stands for the idea that ladies' philosophy's strategy in the beginning is to just offer some kind of calming remedy for his emotional state. Now, this is a dialogue, right? So she needs to say something. But what she says is not going to be like purely rational philosophical argument. She's lady philosophy, but she's going to start by using arguments that aren't actually necessarily good arguments, which may seem kind of strange, but she says this explicitly. She says that her arguments are rhetorical. So she says they have a specious sweetness, honeyed with rhetoric and music, for they're not yet intended to be a cure for your ills, but just a sort of poultice for your pain, which stubbornly resists curing. I shall apply more deeply penetrating remedies when the right time comes. So notice again, this sort of idea, we're going to have 2 stages of treatments. Actually, it's 3. First, we're going to treat your emotional state with rhetoric. Then I'll give you real philosophy, real philosophical arguments to give you the right beliefs, okay? And then we're off and running into the rest of book 1. So I don't need to take you through all the arguments of book 1, but just to give you the kind of flavor of what she means. There's a long section where she talks about the nature of fortune and the fact that fortune sort of distributes worldly goods to people in an apparently random way. And there's this idea of the Wheel of Fortune. We have another nice medieval image of the Wheel of Fortune here, in which, so the idea of the Wheel of Fortune is that people are down and then they're up, right? So you see, you have the king here at the top and the peasants at the bottom, right? So people who were in a high situation wind up being in a low situation. And that's Boethius, right? So he used to be a powerful member of the senatorial aristocratic class in ancient Rome, and he's been thrown down to the level of a miserable prisoner. And then she says, well, that's just how fortune works, right? And, maybe you'll be back up, right? Or even if you're not, then, this is how the game works. And so, just appreciate that you got to be on top for a while, right? Furthermore, it's kind of a lottery. It's random how the goods get distributed. This is just how it works. If you want to play the game, don't complain about the rules. And in fact, if anything, you should bear in mind that you got to be rich and powerful, and most people don't, right? So this is the kind of argument she's giving, and she does this in the voice of fortune. So this is Lady Philosophy pretending to be Lady Fortune in the speech that she gives. So the really significant thing about this, if you think about the kind of treatment, the course of treatment she's offering, is that these rhetorical arguments all completely leave in place his false beliefs, or his maybe bad desires, namely that it's good to have worldly things, right? So when she says, for example, well, remember, you got to be rich, so that was good. Now you're poor, but hey, at least you got to be rich, right? That's not her actual view. So the philosophical way of seeing this would be what the Stoics would say, namely that being rich doesn't matter. But she doesn't say that. She says, remember, you got to be rich. So at least appreciate that, right? So this is a consideration that doesn't revise his beliefs and make them go from false to true. Instead, they just calm him down and get him to be less upset. So that's the mild medicines. The mild medicines are designed to appeal actually to the very false considerations that have led him into trouble, and say, well, even if you think about the world from the prison of these false conceptions, you can see that actually maybe your situation isn't as bad as you thought, or maybe there are some considerations that would be comforting to you, that sort of thing. But these are merely rhetorical arguments. They're not philosophical arguments. Okay. Then we get, and that brings us up to the middle of book 2. In the middle of book 2, we get the passage where she says, okay, now here come the stronger medicines. And the stronger medicines are exactly arguments for rejecting the value of the things that have just been taken for granted as valuable. So, for example, honor, or wealth, or pleasure, physical pleasure. In fact, there's sort of 2 blocks of arguments. One is about physical pleasure and like wealth and like fine clothing. And the next block of argument is about honor and political power. So actually, if you know Plato, like the Republic, remember there's a tripartite soul. So there's reason, and the lower soul is the soul that loves honor and the soul that loves pleasure, right? So this is, I think, significant. What she does is she sort of moves up her way up through the soul, and she says, okay, first, let's eliminate the value of the things the lowest soul, the desiring soul wants, or the appetitive soul. Then let's eliminate the things the spirited soul wants, like honor and political power, and then we'll be ready to deal with reason. Okay. So what's going on here, I think, is that Boethius associates emotional reactions with the lower soul, and there's sort of a 2-step process for dealing with the lower soul when it's upset. One is you calm it down. That was the mild medicines. And now the stronger medicines, you actually challenge the lower soul's opinions or beliefs or value system by saying, well, actually, wealth is not valuable anyway. And he gives the kinds of arguments that the Stoics might give or that Plato might give. So, for example, in Plato, you have the idea, for example, in the Phaedo, that anything good can't have bad effects. And she says, well, money is often very harmful because people use money to do all kinds of bad things, right? Like, I don't know, launch unjust wars or whatever. So money clearly isn't good, right? It could be used well by a virtuous person, but money intrinsically is at best neither good nor bad. Because when bad people use it, it's bad. When good people use it, it's good, right? The standard kind of Socratic, Platonic, Stoic argument. So this is an argument that's designed to eliminate the lower soul's conviction that money would be valuable, right? But again, you don't start with that, right? So this is the Chrysippus idea. You don't start by when you say when you're faced with someone who's upset because their money's all been stolen, you don't say, well, money doesn't matter. You say, calm down, calm down. You got to be rich. Just, in the grand scheme of things, you got pretty lucky, right? And then the lower soul's like, yeah, you're right, I guess. And then you say, oh, and by the way, money's not valuable anyway. So that's a transition from the mild to the strong medicines. This explains why there's some tension in the arguments between the first block and the second block. So from up till the middle of book 2, so up till chapter 4 of book 2, the prisoner was constantly being given these considerations, which from book 2, chapter 5 onward would no longer be considered to be cogent. So for example, one of my favorite examples, in just before the transition to the stronger medicines, the prisoner is told, well, you had a virtuous father-in-law, so that was good. Or actually, he's not dead, so you still have a virtuous father-in-law, so that's good. And then in the very next chapter, Lady Philosophy says, by the way, don't forget that no one else's virtue is your virtue. So you can't count yourself as virtuous because you have a virtuous friend or something like that. So this seems to directly contradict what she's just said, right? But it's not that Boethius, the author, is making a mistake. It's that this is a change in perspective. So the values that were being taken for granted up till the 4th chapter of book 2 are now being questioned as of chapter 5 onward. Or another example is that Boethius's sons were actually both consuls of Rome, so pretty good. And he was reminded in chapter 3 of book 2, well, that was good, right? And now she says, by the way, consulships don't matter. High office is worthless. It's what you do with it, right? It's not the office itself. So that's the stronger medicine. So that was already pretty complicated. But by the end of book 2, if this has worked, the prisoner should have been freed of all of his false beliefs, right? So in general, the beliefs of the lower soul. So beliefs in the value of things like pleasure, wealth, honor, political power. But all that has done is stripped away the bad beliefs and motivations, right? And that should kind of leave him, as it were, blank, right? It might be enough for consolation, actually, but it wouldn't give him a kind of positive set of new values. Now, one way of thinking about what could have happened here is that Boethius, the character, so the prisoner, might have sort of looked into his own soul and found some better beliefs or values, right? And that would kind of go along with Plato's recollection theory. But even in Plato's recollection theory, you might need an outer teacher to provoke you into remembering the truth, right? So that's what Lady Philosophy is going to do next. So she says, and this is very explicit at the beginning of book 3, she says, now let what I have so far shown you of the shape of false happiness suffice if you gaze upon it thoroughly. The next thing in order is to show you what true happiness is. So explicitly marking the mild and strong medicines was removing the false attitudes. Now come true attitudes. And then we're off and running into book 3. We get this Platonist argument that God is the pure good and that everything that comes from God is good. And that addresses Boethius's original worry, which is why do bad things happen to good people? And then the answer is, well, actually the world is providentially ordered. It just doesn't seem that way, right? Again, kind of a standard Stoic picture. We don't need to go into all that, but the point is that this new theory of providence is going to give the prisoner a whole different way of seeing the world. And these are the bitter medicines that are sweet once taken within, which is actually literally dramatized in the work, because after she gives him all these arguments, he says how much does not only the conclusion, the sum of your arguments delight me? So he literally says, I'm like taking pleasure in the doctrines that you're sharing with me. And then I think also confirming the idea that the soul would actually have in itself the resources to restore itself to truth or discover truth. He starts to actually chip in and give his own philosophical arguments. That is, the prisoner does, right? So up until this point, it's just lady philosophy offering him one consideration after another. Now the prisoner's like, oh, and here's another thing. Here's an argument for like providence or whatever. And lady philosophy praises this and says, this shows that you're being cured. So as she says, as doctors are accustomed to hope, this is a sign of nature that is now upright and resistant. Partially quoting that just to show you the consistency with which Boethius holds on to this medical analogy, comes up again and again and again. Okay. Now, so that's our reading of books 1 to 3 of the Consolation. And that's really the part where medicine is relevant. So the medical metaphor carries through books 1 till the end of book 3, and then it kind of falls away, which poses a little bit of a problem for us. Actually, two problems. One is what happens? Like, what did he just forget? That he was trying to compare the entire process to a course of medical treatments. But also, I think maybe a more pressing problem is if he's cured and given a better set of values by the end of book 3, why are there 5 books in the Consolation and not 3? Right? So it seems like we've got 2 extra books. It's almost as if Boethius wrote books 1 to 3, set it aside, and then came back and added books 4 to 5, which actually is possible. They're kind of different in tone. But bear in mind, he wrote all this while he was in house arrest and then he was put to death. So maybe not a lot of time for him to like set aside the project and come back to it. But in any case, I think that the rest of this, what I'm going to say, is quite speculative. But I think that there is a plausible story we can tell about how books 4 and 5 work. So here we have to know something about what happens in books 4 and 5. So in books 4 and 5, the prisoner says, okay, that was great, but there's a couple of things I'm still worried about. So I have some objections to your divine providence-based rationale and theodicy for everything that happens in the universe. And the most famous one, so actually the book 4 one, so there's 2. There's one that's dealt with in book 4, another that's dealt with in book 5. The book 4 one is about, well, why do evil people prosper? And then she's got a story to explain that. The book 5 problem is it's actually the most famous part of the Consolation, because that's where Boethius gets into the question of whether humans can have free will, given that God knows in advance what they'll do. And this is super famous, became a hugely influential part of the Consolation, and gave rise to a long-running medieval discussion of divine foreknowledge. So this is actually the part that philosophers like best. It's the part that's least relevant for our paper. Why is this here? Well, maybe because we want to see that the prisoner has not only been cured, but also given the tools to stop himself from relapsing. So the thought here would be that if he doesn't have an explanation of why not only like why do good people suffer, but why is it that bad people do well, right? So that sort of threatens to undermine everything she's done, like this whole story about divine providence that we got in book 3. He's got to be able to handle this objection, right? Similarly, if it turns out that nobody has any free will because God knows in advance what they'll do, then there's no such thing as good and bad people, right? Because everyone's just determined to do whatever they do, right? There's no such thing as virtue. So that would undermine the entire treatment. So in effect, what she's doing here is tantamount to what a doctor would do by making sure that the patient stays cured, right? So, and this actually, of course, completely corresponds to what ancient doctors did. So what we have is not even a 3-step process, but a 4-step process, which even I think is probably pretty recognizable for modern doctors as well. So what do you do with a patient who's suffering from an illness? Like say they've got an inflammation. So the first thing is put a cold compress on the inflammation, right? Get it to stop the pain, right? Stop the symptoms. Then once you've done that, figure out what the source of the symptoms would be and treat that. That's step 2. So that's mild medicines, strong medicines. Then you build the patient's health back up. That's the bitter medicines that become sweet. And then you offer a regime for keeping the patient sort of fit to stay healthy. And in fact, something that's worth knowing about ancient medicine is that this is the thing they were best at. So if you go to an ancient doctor and you're already sick, as you might imagine, your chances of getting help are minimal, right? Because, it was the 2nd century, the 5th century, like they don't know anything, right? So they weren't going to be able to heal most of your diseases. They could heal some diseases. And in fact, they could do some pretty amazing things, like in the Islamic world, they could perform successful eye surgery, which is an alarming but also impressive thought. But the real strength of ancient medicine is their they have this very complicated and sophisticated set of prescriptions for exercise regimes, diets, and just generally like lifestyle advice, which Galen talks about a lot. Again, this would be tailored to the individual patient very carefully, and this would keep them healthy. So that means that the entire consolation corresponds to what an ancient doctor would do, or even a modern doctor would do. You eliminate the suffering caused by symptoms, you eliminate the disease, you build the patient's health back up, and then you make sure that they stay healthy. And so that's why this is, consolation in this very expanded sense is something that Boethius thought would be worth comparing to medicine. In fact, as far as I know, this is the most sophisticated attempt in antiquity to compare what philosophers do to medicine, because it's so complicated, has so many parts, and he's really thought through how what lady philosophy is going to do corresponds to an actual course of medical treatment. It's not this kind of banal, well, we treat souls just like doctors cure the body. This is really, this is a metaphor that's been thought out down to the last detail. And so I think it's actually a really important case, an interesting case of the topic that you're looking at, namely philosophy of medicine in antiquity. And here's one last nice picture from a manuscript of Boethius. Thanks very much.
And a clap. I'm trying to remember how I clap. Oh, there we go.
I think that counts as clapping. If you,
I think
if
that's
you say
kind
that
of
you
clapping.
like to clap.
Some children shouting in the background. I realized that they have opened the door. Oh no. Here comes Spider-Man. 7? Yeah, okay. You close the door. Right, sorry about that. It's just, one of those things with modern academia online.
Actually, my cat just turned up, so
Oh, good.
he's less likely to
Can you
cause
close the door
fuss.
behind you, please? I'm trying to chair a seminar. Thank you. Okay, sorry about that. That's all my no, not all of them actually. So thank you very much for that, Peter. That was fascinating. So we now have time for Q&A. If you want to ask a question, feel free to just raise your hand, I think. Or, you can type it in the chat, but I don't think there's a particular need for that method if people just want to raise their hands. No hands. Whilst people think about it, Peter, can I ask a
No,
question?
we got three hands already.
We've got 3 hands already. Why can't I see them?
So Hamed's first, I guess.
Well, oh, I see. Okay, sorry. I won't ask a question. I'll put myself dutifully in the queue. I've recently been taught by American methods on chair privilege. Okay, Hamed, please go ahead.
Yeah. Can you hear me well?
Yeah. Yeah.
All right. Thank you very much, Peter. This was very interesting. So my question is, you have this concept of health of soul, and as you gave a very nice example of it, and also referred to the concept as it is presented in Plato, like the just soul, and the healthy soul, and how it compares to body. So I'm wondering how these concepts is comparable to the concept of mental health, because we can have a concept of mental health in the Galenic kind of framework as well, in the humor type of medicine, type of humor associated with certain type of personality and imbalance of them, resulting in mental disorder or kind of mental illness. So I'm wondering, do you think that the type of illnesses that philosophers aim to heal, or the philosophy can heal in the eyes of these ancient philosophers, is equivalent to mental health in mental disorders, or it is something else? And we should carve a space for mental health that is dealt with by the physicians, and a health of soul that is dealt with philosophers? Or you think that philosophers are actually suggesting an alternative to the usual medicine of the time, or something that is complementary? So I'm wondering, how do you compare these, and where do you think the real disease is, and where do you think the remedy is aimed at? Thank you.
Right. Okay. Yeah, that's an interesting question. So I think what the philosophers would say is that they saw a very close relationship between what they thought of as mental health and physical health. And it goes back to this thing about there being multiple parts of the soul. So if you think about the prisoner's situation at the beginning, or a vicious person in Plato, their problem is that the lower soul is dominating their rational soul, right? And that's very much like one humor dominating the other humors, right? It's an imbalance, right? And they even talk about it as an imbalance, right? In fact, remember that in Plato and the Republic, what's gone wrong in a vicious soul is literally called an injustice, because there isn't like the right proportion, right, between the soul parts. So when they think of mental health or psychological health, what they're thinking of is something like gluttony or lasciviousness, or an improper desire for honor, something like that. That would be for them a mental disease, right? So I think that's the basic answer to your question. It has to be said that, of course, they know that there's also what we think of as the mental disease, like a mental illness, like insanity, right? And so then there's a further question about what they would say about insanity. But interestingly, I think they would say, oh, that's just physical health. So let's take a concrete example. So one of the most important diseases discussed in antiquity by doctors, like Rufus of Ephesus, for example, has a whole treatise on this, is melancholy. Now we have the word melancholy, we use it to mean you're sad, but they had a whole range of symptoms that they associated with melancholy, like even including delusions. So someone who was suffering from schizophrenia, they might have called the person melancholic. Okay. Now, where does the word melancholy come from? It comes from the Greek for black bile, right? Chole is bile. So they thought that that was a buildup of black bile causing something like fumes in your brain or something like that. And that was causing these symptoms. But they don't think of that as really a problem in your soul. And there's a good reason for this, which is that the soul is an immaterial substance in this. I mean, it depends who you ask. So the Stoics wouldn't say that, but in late antiquity, at least, or Galen, who's some kind of Platonist, they think of the soul as somehow being affected by the body, or maybe its ability to engage with the body is affected by physical states. But the soul in itself is not going to be directly impaired by a physical state, right? So they would think, if they think that melancholy, something like a delusion, is caused by a buildup of black bile, what they would have to say is, well, this is preventing the soul from using the brain properly. So they wouldn't think of that as mental health. They would think of that as physical health, ironically, from our point of view.
Thank you very much.
So Raphael.
Hi, Peter.
Hey,
sorry,
Rich.
my camera's not working. But I
I
did
would say good
notice.
to see you, but
Sorry about yeah. And I did notice the Arsenal logo in the background, so you must be a very happy man at the moment. Okay, so, I had a but more of that another time. I had a suggestion and a question. So the suggestion was about, I think it was the slide. I don't know if you can go back on the slides, but where you were talking about possible resonance with the Platonic recollection argument, and it was something about the middle, it being a middle way that made me think of another possible Platonic reference.
there it is. Yeah.
Here we are. Yeah. The middle. This is, I think that's a reference. Isn't that the reference to the symposium? Actually, whoever seeks the truth is in a middle state. So I think symposium around about 204A to
Good.
be
Okay. Yeah.
the philosophos is, this middle guy between the ignorant person and the wise person. So that, I mean, it may be recollection as well, but that really does sound like the symposium, which of course has some medical stuff in it as well. That may not be relevant, but anyway.
So you mean like Eros being like a daimon being between the human and the divine world? That's
Yeah, it's that passage, and that's where you
good.
specifically get the idea that the philosophos is in that middle state, way lover of whatever they love.
That's super. Thanks.
The question. So, just to clarify, Peter, was the claim that, or your suggestion was that these three stages kind of map onto something like a tripartite soul?
Kind of. I mean, so
yeah,
it would have been neat if like the first battery of arguments was the lowest soul, the second was the spirited soul, and the third was the rational soul.
Yeah.
But it's not that, it doesn't work out like that, because it looks like the idea is more that the lower, first of all, Boethius doesn't ever talk about the tripartite soul explicitly. He at best kind of alludes to the notion that you have a lower soul, which is the passionate soul, and the higher soul, which is rational. Okay. So he's maybe lumping together the appetitive and the spirited soul, actually, which is quite common.
So I mean, I was wondering if an even more radical sort of non-partite reading might be possible, because I know that Boethius says that part one is rhetorical, but it still sounds, I mean, maybe rhetorical in the sense that it's, as you said, based on the prisoner's false value system. It still seems to be all about beliefs about what's good and bad. So I mean, it sounded like the first stage sounded like it's a bit of Socratic dialectic. You start where the interlocutor is, you start with their belief system and kind of work up from that, and you say, okay, within your belief system you're actually doing okay, but that still seems to be about persuasion on the basis of what the interlocutor believes. I mean, rational, okay, it's a weak sense of rational, but at least whatever part of the soul they're talking to seems to be able to be responsive to arguments on the basis of beliefs. And then, part two is, I mean, you could do this all Socratically, I suppose. Part two is, well, then you actually get rid of the false beliefs, and then you give them some true ones, which Socrates never seems to get around to, admittedly. So then Plato writes the Republic, and away we go.
Yeah, that's why I lady philosophers are better.
Yeah, but could one not just run it as a kind of a purely sort of cognitive soul? I wasn't sure what was necessarily motivating the idea that we have to talk about, especially if, as you say, Boethius doesn't himself talk about apartheid.
Yeah, I mean, so one thing that really pushed me in that direction was the fact that you have these two sets of arguments which are assigned to first pleasures and then honors.
Oh, I see. Okay.
And I thought, okay, so he must be thinking of the Platonic soul there, right? Even if he doesn't say so. And then, so then actually Tad and I had talked about this a lot, because part of the problem is that Boethius is both in the tradition of Stoicism, which has a single rational soul, and Platonism, which has a partite soul, right? And so and he doesn't thematize this in the work,
right,
or anywhere else. And I don't think there's anywhere else in Boethius where this is discussed,
right?
So that makes it difficult to say. But my thought was that if he has the idea that the lower soul is responsible for generating emotional reactions and is characterized by having beliefs about, on the one hand, pleasure plus money, because money is always associated with pleasure, and on the other hand, honor, then the idea would be that the first two kinds of healing are directed at the disease. First, the symptoms, which is the emotions, then the cause, which is the false beliefs. And so that's why I was thinking that the false beliefs are left standing in the first step, because you're only dealing with the symptoms.
Yeah.
That was the idea. But I agree that you can try to run the whole thing as a kind of sequential, like, well, I'll strip away one layer of belief at a time. Part of the problem here is that, you know, if all she does is give him a hug, then there's no dialogue, right? So she actually does, like I said, there's that scene where she dries his tears, right? So Boethius is aware that he might want to show her responding just to the emotional state without even using argument.
Yes.
But then obviously the dialogue needs to keep going. So I thought that the point about rhetoric is that you're not even trying to shift the guy's belief. You're just sort of saying, oh, let's take your beliefs all as they are. And then, like, even within that set of beliefs, get you to calm down by saying things like, oh, it's not so bad, you know.
Yeah. It's still, I mean, fair enough, and maybe this is sort of undecidable, but it was surprising how rationalistic even the first stage turned out to be when you actually gave the example. Like, you know, look, you've had a good innings.
Yeah.
And then you're supposed to think, I've had lots of this good stuff. And so really, by my own value system, and that's quite a sophisticated bit of teardrop.
Yeah, she doesn't. So, for example, she doesn't say something like, aren't you ashamed to be carrying on like this? That would maybe be a more direct appeal to his emotions.
Yeah.
Right. Actually, I think she does say some things like that, like sort of man up. But yeah, I take what you're saying, but I think if you sort of take your cue from the signposting,
right,
then I still think that there's a lot of evidence in what I showed that shows that the first part is about emotions and the second part is about beliefs.
Okay, good, thanks.
It's meant to be. Maybe he doesn't carry it through as well as he could.
Yeah,
it's another possibility.
Yep,
thanks.
I think you're muted, Elsenine.
I guess it's Dan.
Thanks, Rivka. Sorry, I was muted. Sorry, it's just there's a question in the chat that I think I need to treat as a finger on Hamed's question. Shall I read it out, or do you want to read it out, Peter?
I can read it out if you want.
You read it out, please.
Okay, my interest touches on Hamed's question about mental health as I study and champion a generic conceptual framework called Hodge's model. As the Hodge's model is embedded within the spiritual, I feel guilty, in this respect, as it may appear to some that the spiritual is an afterthought, but is more acknowledging that the spiritual is in that sense of the unknown, unknowable, and what's beyond us. In this model, we can identify and represent parity of esteem, the need to acknowledge the mental and physical. So you prompted the thought of this as the first cognitive therapy. And then there's a link to a blog about
I think that is not a question, but a comment.
Yeah, more of a comment than a question.
More of a comment than a question.
But it is, I mean, in a way, I think if you're interested in that, the place to look is in the stuff about God in book 3, because that's where you have, like, there's the body and the soul, but actually all of that is way below the truly spiritual good, which is divine, right? So yeah, that might be a good source for you, actually.
Thanks, Peter. Dan Ferguson is next on my Zoom generated list.
Thanks. I'm wondering how this second middle stage works, and in particular, whether it wouldn't cause the kinds of problems, these emotional upsets that are supposed to cloud the mind, right? So it sounded like the second stage was about challenging these false beliefs and values. But it seems like, you know, if I'm someone who's really wedded to status or money, and then you start telling me things like, or even arguing for things like, oh, actually, that doesn't matter, or money doesn't matter, I could well imagine someone thinking like, oh, having the same kind of emotional reactions that they were having when they failed to achieve status, or when they've, now fallen into rags or riches.
Mhm.
I guess I'm wondering, does Boethius worry about that kind of problem, or if he doesn't, does he have a good response to the potential flare-ups of the first stage symptoms in light of how the second stage is?
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, I think that could happen, but as far as I can tell, the way that that's addressed is by saying, it's that point of the Chrysippus point, like, I have to get you calm first, and then you'll be ready for the strong medicine. So the thought would be, well, if I put you in a position where you can kind of be a fair judge of the arguments I'm giving you, then you'll see that they're right. So in a sense, I mean, there's maybe an ambiguity about what it means to have your reason in charge, right? So the fullest sense would be that your values are those of rationality. So you only want the true good, you only want virtue, something like that, right? But there's maybe a weaker sense of having rationality in charge, where it just means you're now susceptible to rational argument. And so the thought is that the reason she starts with a rhetoric is that he's not ready for rational arguments. But once we get to the end, to the middle of book 2, now he's calm. So and by the way, there maybe I should have said there are a lot of like dialogical signs that he is actually calming down. Like he's weeping, he can't talk, and so on. But he becomes progressively kind of more collected, right? So my thought here would be that the strong medicines come in when he's been put in a position where his rational soul can actually say, yes, that's a good argument. So I should like tell my desiring soul to shut up. Right.
Yeah, and I guess also some additional assumption, like reason is in control, that when I challenge your very values, I'm not going to get so upset, at least, that I can't see the goodness of the argument. I mean, that's an interesting assumption. It might well be true, but
Yeah.
that seems worth flagging.
Yeah,
because you might not think people would like that.
Well, actually, it's an interest. So I think there's an empirical question, right? Right. But I think maybe it's also important to remember that Boethius is not just or the prisoner is not just some guy. So it actually is mentioned numerous times that she says things like, you used to know all this. Like you used to be, she says things like, you used to be one of mine. You were a philosopher. As this goes back to the stuff about being reminded or brought back to things that you already know. So maybe it's supposed to be at least more plausible dramatically that he would accept the arguments that question the lower soul's values, because he used to have the right beliefs anyway. And it was really his misfortune which kind of threw his soul out of whack. Whereas maybe, someone who wasn't in such a favorable starting point beforehand wouldn't be able to so quickly put themselves in a position where their reason could start to use argument to dominate their lower soul.
Thanks.
Sorry, Gideon Manning. Gideon Manning.
Hey, Gideon. Long time no see.
It's almost noon here in California. So I'm sorry I'm late, and but I caught most of it. And I actually have a question about consolation more generally. So it's not an exegetical question. It's sort of a question about consolation as a chronic state of need, and consolation as sort of acute when you're in prison, or specifically at death, right? At the deathbed, right? So we think of the role of the philosopher, if you cast it in some ways, as preparing us for death, but it becomes especially acute when people are actually dying. And there are, in the periods I know a bit better, like in the 16th century, shifting roles between the priest offering consolation at the end of life and the physician, who in some instances specifically claims the title of philosopher. So part of what I'm interested in asking about is, is there sensitivity to the shifting moments in one's life where consolation and the sort of needs you've identified here and are so important in the tradition become especially important? And do you do it differently? Are there actual practices that are meant to facilitate it? You know, I mean, because it seems like you got to make a decision soon to reconcile yourself to the end, as opposed to, you know, when you have this long chronic condition that you're dealing with, as opposed to that acute moment at the end.
Yeah, that's a great question. Wow. Okay, that's something that I would like to think about more, to be honest. I mean, one thing that comes to mind is that there's actually two kind of paradigms of consolatory literature in antiquity. One is, I'm consoling you because someone has died, but it's not you, obviously, right? So, for example, Seneca wrote a letter to someone consoling her for a loss in her family, which is maybe one of Boethius' sources, actually, one of his inspirations. So that's one kind of work. Then there's another kind of work, which is the deathbed scene. And of course, the granddaddy of this would be Plato, the Phaedo.
Mm-hmm.
But a great example of it would be Gregory of Nyssa's treatise on soul and resurrection, where his sister is dying, Macrina. I wrote a paper about this recently. So his sister Macrina is dying, and she's talking about the fact that her soul is immortal, and so she's not really dying, very much like Socrates. So what's interesting in those cases is that it's the person dying who's offering the consolation, right? Because Socrates has to console his buddies, right? And she has to, and actually Gregory again puts himself in the dialogue, and he's like in pieces. He's like really, really upset at the beginning, and she has to kind of comfort him. And then she says, you know, I'm not really dying here, right? This is just my body dying, right? And so actually, I wonder whether there's a, maybe this is in some way a response to what you're saying, which is that if someone else has died, then the philosopher can talk to you. But if you're about to die, then what you need is to see kind of a version of your own self and who you might be in that situation, namely Socrates, right? So try to be like Socrates, try to face your death with equanimity. And maybe that's why there's this sort of difference in tone between works offering consolations for bereavement and works that are actually imagining, where you're asked to imagine yourself as the person who's dying. Right?
I mean, I think one
that's aimed at someone who is dying.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I would just add is that I think as the notion of a good death starts to sort of take more formulaic shape, you start finding it goes in both directions. So the good death involves a performance by the person dying where they're both expected to console others, but then there's still also a process where they are themselves consoled. So I don't know if I want to resist the two traditions as, you know, in antiquity, I don't know enough, but later on, I think there's considerable overlap, you know?
There is actually a third genre, which is texts about old age, which I'm actually getting really interested in at the moment.
Yeah, no, those are absolutely fascinating. And they get even more, well, more fascinating in the 16th and 17th century, if you ask me.
Absolutely.
Still. Yeah, absolutely.
And so again, Seneca would be an example here. And I mean, in a way, like if you think about, I mean, if someone's literally like dying right now, it may be too late to write a work of philosophy for them, right? But if they're just getting old, so part of what it is to be old, I mean, being old is about more than just getting close to death. It's about the decay of the body and maybe the weakening of your faculties and so on. One thought, of course, that you get like already in Republic Book 1 is that could be a good thing. Like Cephalus saying, oh, thank God I don't want to have sex all the time anymore. This is such a relief, right? But certainly part of what's going on when you're aging is that you're getting closer to death. So it's almost like a long deathbed process, right? And so all these works about aging are in some ways responses to your issue, I think.
Yeah. No, I think that's right. One final thought, and then I'll step away, which is that a complicating factor is Catholicism and Christianity, right? So in that final moment for that tradition, you know, you have to sort of own up to it all, and get good with God and so on. But one of the things that's really curious in the 16th century is there is almost like a secular pushback. So people can have that encounter with the priest at the end, and then there's still room for the philosopher physician to return to the deathbed to console the dying person. So, there's a temptation to think that the role is handed over to the spiritual advisor, the priest, who sort of takes over some things from the informed Greek traditions of consolation and so on. But that role turns out to not be sufficient. And it's not enough consolation. And so you find these earlier traditions reemerging in the guidelines offered to physicians and others.
Right.
Yeah.
There's,
Okay.
I mean, there's also all the Christ as healer stuff. So there's a kind of competition, like who is it that's going to heal your problems?
That's exactly right. Is it a kind of cultural a spiritual medicinamentis, mentis, or is it something more like the tradition that we read more consistently?
It's a classic Renaissance phenomenon, right? So all this pagan literature starts to flood around Europe, and then the Christian literature was already performing various roles that the pagan literature was now competing to perform. And so the question is, whose job is this?
Yeah. And by the end of the 17th century into the 18th century, it's the physicians at the deathbed more and more. Not the priest.
Thanks.
Yuting Wang? Sorry, I probably got that wrong.
That's a perfect pronunciation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, Professor Adamson, this is not my field of research, but I find it quite interesting because I don't know that this philosophia lady exists in the conservation. So I have a question: does this chapter or this book has any link to the effective turn today? Because I see it has a bodily metaphor of philosophy as medicine, and through which you have access to the emotions. And I find it quite fascinating that something medieval can have this perspective. So I'm quite curious if there's any continuity today as in the effective turn.
Yeah, I mean, I may not know enough about the effective turn, but something that, so if that's associated with sort of the ideas about holism, like treating the entire patient at the same time, then that's absolutely part of ancient medicine and also the concept of ancient philosophy as medicine. There's a fantastic passage in Plato's dialogue called Charmides, where Plato has Socrates say that there's a sort of something that competent doctors do is that, and this is one of the rare ancient texts, early ancient texts that actually mentions Hippocrates as a specific figure, like he names Hippocrates. Anyway, he says that the Hippocratic theory is that you should treat the entire patient and not just one part, right? And by extension, you should treat the patient's entire body and soul. And this is what you would get from Galen. So this is what Galen is claiming to do, is to treat this, is to offer tailored, bespoke treatment for each person who comes to him, and to treat their entire self. So their emotional states, their physical, like literal, like what stuff is in their body, or their builds up of humors, but also he wrote works on ethics as well. So this kind of idea that the doctor deals with everything about you all at once, that's very deep in ancient medicine. So I don't know if that's relevant to your question, but it's what comes to mind at least.
It's inspirational. But Plato, he's sort of like an evil guy for me, because he's like
no.
So there's your body, here's the perfect idea, and here's you as the simulacrum. So
yeah, I can see why you say that. But I mean, so I'm just writing something down here before I forget. So, I mean, I can see why you say that, but in a way, like you might be thinking more of a version of Plato that has come down through the tradition and is in a way oversimplified.
Okay.
So, I mean, for sure, there are ideas. There are parts of Plato, like the Phaedo in particular, where you would sort of take it from it the idea that, or the lesson that you are not your body, you're just your soul, and your body is like a piece of clothing that you can take off and put on and so on. So that's in Plato, but there's lots of other stuff going on in Plato. There's this passage from the Charmides, for example, but also in the Timaeus, which is one of his most influential dialogues, actually. You have a very elaborate and anatomical theory about the human body. And that was really interesting to later doctors. So for example, Galen wrote a commentary on the Timaeus, and the reason he did that is that he was interested in the part about the anatomy. So yeah, so I mean, I think like there's the sort of dualist Platonist cliche, and you can think of that as your enemy, that's fine. But you shouldn't necessarily think that's Plato.
Okay.
It's like Marx saying he wasn't a Marxist.
Oh, that I get. Thank you. Do you mind if I write to you later and you can give me the books you mentioned?
Sure, yeah.
Them all. Thank you.
Sure.
Great. I can't see any more hands raised, so I'm hoping I can ask my own question. It's as always, it's like terribly off topic, and it's betraying my entire failure to deal appropriately with ancient philosophy. But nonetheless, I mean, when I, with my not historically informed sort of eyes look at this, it's really striking when like you think about all the things that contemporary psychotherapies, right? Currently it's CBT, but there's all these versions. And I mean, it's not entirely clear always what they engage in, but they engage in like, they might well recognize them in some of the model of what, how do we pronounce it? Boethius was working in, right? We do a bit of consolation. I mean, people describe this, they put people on antidepressants because you can't get the CBT until you're, enough out of the doldrums, and that they can then, and then they go mess with your mind, and they try and kind of instill better beliefs. And now, of course, that's like a massive anachronistic. I mean, I'm aware of that, right? Like a comparison. But I just sort of wonder if you're contemporary mental health practitioner, would it be helpful to think of yourself as standing in this sort of intellectual history where philosophy is, your sort of direct ancestor, in a sense that, a contemporary mental health practitioner, in a way, is doing philosophy with people, or the people who are engaging in mental health practice are doing philosophy in a way that's much more like what certain historical figures were doing that we call philosophers, then, what I'm doing and what many of my kind of academic philosophers in philosophy departments are doing. Does that seem, I mean, I guess one question is, does that seem fair? Or am I just going like wildly overboard?
No, I think that's
And
absolutely
then the question is that if it is fair, why don't should we do more of that? Why don't we do more with that? Because that's not, I think, how the mental health practitioners would ever think of themselves or be taught.
Yeah, right. Yeah, so I think that actually I think this is an important kind of thing to know, both for medical practitioners and for philosophers. So from thinking about it from a philosopher's point of view, you can think, oh, look how ambitious we used to be. We thought we could, restore people to happiness when they were unhappy. And now we would never think that that was our job, right? We think our job is sort of, you know, a bit of conceptual clarification around the edges of the natural sciences, right? Often. So that I think is worth a message worth getting out. But I think also for healthcare professionals, there's maybe two things. One is, yeah, like to say, look, you know, you might think that this thing that you're doing is only about 30 years old, but actually it's 3,000 years old, right? And that's, you know, maybe encouraging, or maybe it's also a kind of argument you could use for the value of what you're doing. But I think that it may go beyond that. So I think like a mental health care professional who reads a letter of Seneca or even the Consolation of Philosophy, although it's pretty dry in parts, or even, you know, Confucian texts, which are very similar in a lot of ways. These are works where you're being shown not just a kind of earlier model which might remind you of what you're doing, but it might actually give you some insight into why what you're doing could work. So in particular, I think what Boethius would give you, if this analysis is correct, what Boethius could give you is like it could help you to think about when and how does rational argument actually play a role in what we're doing here, right? So to what extent does just giving someone a good reason for not being upset? So famously, that's not usually very effective, right? And in fact, it could be almost tasteless, like to show up to a funeral and say to the mother whose child has passed away, oh, well, here's why you shouldn't be upset. That would be like a grossly impolite thing to do, right? It would be inappropriate. And I think we all recognize that. Yet at some point, it seems like it needs to kick in. So why, when? And you know, I think you can do better than just have a sort of feel that you've acquired over years worth of experience of when to start using that kind of consideration. You might have a theory about why and when it works. And I think reflecting on that could certainly be helpful. Yeah. Hello, by the way.
I muted myself.
The average age of the audience just dropped.
Yes, it did. It did very much so.
Always welcome.
I said thanks, Peter. That was a very generous answer to my question. I mean, it's the second time this seminar, and I wonder if I should do something with this and teach you how to consume. Please don't touch that, Emmy. Okay, I think that this is also Little Angel that's calling for maybe the end time.
She looks like she might need to go to bed.